Hi, everyone. Welcome to the April 16th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, TimeformUS Analyst, and I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host, Craig Milkowski, the TimeformUS Chief Speed Figuremaker. Well, this is it. We've seen the Kentucky Derby winner in action. We've seen him complete his preparation in the afternoons, at least. And I don't know who he is, but the past performances are set. We just have to wait the 3 weeks, see how they train coming up to the race. But the final preparations, the final prep races were completed this past weekend. And the major story of the past weekend was the Arkansas Derby. And we'll discuss that in depth, along with the lesser prep race, the Lexington Stakes at Keeneland, which is unlikely to produce a starter in the Kentucky Derby. We'll also talk about some of the undercard races at Oaklawn Park throughout the weekend, as well as Keeneland and Santa Anita and Aqueduct. So we'll just get right to it. Craig, you were at Oaklawn this weekend. I hope you stayed dry. How was your experience down there?
It was great. Saturday was obviously wet. Friday was as nice a day as you could possibly ask for, and then Sunday was pretty nice too. But made the best we could out of Saturday. Saw some really good racing and some. I assume we're going to see really top contenders in the Derby and some other races. It was just a really good weekend of racing.
Yeah, I've never been to Oaklawn. Is there like an opportunity to stay dry there? I mean, was it the kind of situation where it was just like raining constantly throughout the day, or were able to take shelter?
Yeah, I was. Mostly, to be honest, on Saturday, I hung out in the press box just because of the weather. But the grandstand's all enclosed, and there's plenty of seating. We also had seats, which we sat in for a little bit. So I stayed dry. I didn't venture outside at all on Saturday, other than from the car to the grandstand and back. But it was just a monsoon all day long. It really never let up. Other than right at the Derby, believe it or not, the rain kind of let up for a few minutes. I'm sure it didn't change the track, but it actually wasn't raining much during the Derby itself, which was about the only time all day.
Well, from my TV screen, it certainly looked like the track was a mess for the race. And we'll get to the discussion of the Arkansas Derby, because I think there is a lot to dissect coming out of this race. We saw Omaha Beach win this race. He ran the fastest TimeformUS speed figure that we've seen throughout this entire prep season, beating his main rival, the Bob Baffert trainee Improbable. It was a really exciting race to watch. These two really hooked up and threw it down through the stretch of this race. And I would imagine they're two of the main contenders moving on to Kentucky.
Yeah, I would think so as well. Omaha Beach really impressed me. He made that big move on the backstretch. I was kind of cringing a little bit. I had visions of Abel Tasman making that early move to the lead, but he was able to hold strong and actually finished really strong. If you look at our pace figures, the race kind of slowed down a little bit at that point. And maybe Mike Smith sensed it and kind of took over and made that move, because through the stretch, his numbers were actually increasing. His figure was a 118 after 6 furlongs, up to a full 123 at the wire. So this horse has tactical speed. He can finish. He obviously drew a sloppy track here, but he's shown he can run on a fast track. And I think he's probably going to be the favorite in the Derby. If not, I think he should be.
Yeah, especially if Mike Smith opts to go with him, which I would assume is going to happen. I would imagine he will be the favorite in the Kentucky Derby. I do want to dissect his trip a little more and just talk about the tactics that Mike Smith used in this race, where he got him to the outside as soon as he was able to and made that early move towards the front. In the early portion of this race, he did kind of strike me as a horse that was not comfortable racing in behind horses. As they passed under the wire for the first time, he was really climbing. He was kind of throwing his front feet up. And there's actually a really cool picture of him. Forget who took it. I saw it on Twitter, of him almost rearing up as he was past the wire the first time, because he was just jumping over the kickback. Maybe that was due to the sloppy track and the fact that there's much coming back into his face, and that might not be the case on a fast track. He did seem like he really relaxed and got into a much better rhythm when Mike Smith got him to the out, when he was able to actually poke his head in front on the backstretch. At that point, he really seemed to relax and slow down the pace a little bit, and had left because of that to finish off the race and beat Improbable in the stretch. But I wanted to get your take on how the early portion of the race went for this horse, and if that ramifications for how they would ride him in the Kentucky Derby.
I think he definitely looks like a horse that wants to be clear. I found that picture that talking about fascinating. I'll try to retweet it if I can find it after we post the show today, because I mean his legs were in the air. It's hard to say exactly without watching the replay how much of an effect it had, but he does seem like he was a little bottled up and not happy about it. But once he got clear, he was good, and we've seen that trip in the Derby where horses just wide to avoid trouble and just fine with it. Probable had a bit of a trip as well. He had some gait trouble. Can't remember who the horse was who was acting up during the load, but after a bit, Improbable was quite a bit unhappy. Did it very well, but I'm kind of around to your side. I just don't think he's a horse that's want to go the Derby distance, so I'll probably be going against it in the Derby at a somewhat low price. Definitely a good horse. He's probably one of the top horses in the division. Just not sure that he wants to go a mile and a quarter and later, a mile and a half.
The horse that was acting up in the gate actually was Improbable. He was a little unsettled. He was a little unsettled before the race, and I actually had to back him out and put him back in right before the start. Watching on TV, it actually looked like he almost sat down before the race, and they kind of got him straightened out for that. He was not happy before the race started. During the race, I felt like Improbable was in a more uncomfortable position for a longer period of time than Omaha Beach. I think he too was reacting great kickback. He wasn't the same way that Omaha Beach was early, but he just seemed to be totally comfortable racing horses. And part of it was probably the fact that he was on the worst part of the track early in the race, and Jose Ortiz got him to the end as soon as possible. He didn't move at the same time Omaha Beach, but he also made a pretty early move on the half-mile pole to get into position, and he never really got a breather because along that move as they came to the top and tried to go after Omaha Beach at that point. I thought Improbable never really quit. He didn't really lose a lot of ground in Omaha Beach through the final eighth of a mile. I was concerned about that, given the fact it's a city zip, and there's been so much talk about how a city zip is not going to want to go these classic distances. I thought Improbable actually handled the mile pretty well for his first time trying it, and I'm not against this horse. I feel like I like him more now than I did prior to this race because he did overcome a little bit of adversity, and he gave me some hope that he actually can handle the distance because he was finishing off this race pretty strongly. When you compare the way these two came home as opposed to the rest of the field, even comparing them to a closer like Country House, they were really pretty quickly. Even the closing fraction compared to the Oaklawn handicap, relatively fast first two finishers. So I've got some high hope for these two moving on to Kentucky. I think both of these are major players and maybe Improbable. I guess now he's Baffert's third stringer, which is to say because he was probably at the top of a lot of people's lists coming into the prep races. Now he's lost both of them, and I guess he's not among the favorites anymore. But I still think Improbable's a player in this division. The other horses coming out of this race, Country House earned enough points to on the Kentucky Derby. He would need a total pace collapse. I didn't see him do a ton of running in this race. He was just picking up pieces at the end. And I think yet if they're going to move on long-range Toddy. He did not run well in this race, but he does have the points to move on to the Kentucky Derby, so I assume they will do so. This race earned a high speed figure, though. How would you compare this race to some of the other preps that we've seen?
It was as good as we've seen. I don't think the figure lies. A horse like Country House is a good point. He was a little bit deceiving in that you think he was making this close, but he actually lost ground to the top two through the stretch. I think he was 5 back with a furlong to go and was beaten almost 7. You always have to be a little leery of the sloppy track. I'm sure horses like Long Range Toddy, that's a built-in excuse. Hard for me to say whether it's a legitimate excuse or not. He did draw an outside post. He didn't get that ground-saving trip like he did in the Rebel. But it's definitely a fast race. As a speed figure guy, with the weather, it was a tough day to make figures early on. But luckily for me, the last 4 races were about as tight as you're going to find on a sloppy track. So as far as some of the other figures are a little bit questionable in my mind, but as far as the Arkansas Derby, it's as solid as they come.
And while this number of 121 is only 1 point higher than the previous top figure we had seen, which I believe was run by Tacitus, correct me if I'm wrong, the final time figure for this race I noticed was a 123, and it was adjusted down because this race did feature a pretty moderate pace. But that 123 is significantly higher than most of the other figures we've seen throughout this Derby trail. So the times they finished up in was pretty quick compared to the other 3-year-olds that have been in action this spring. One other thing I do want to mention coming out of this race is the Mike Smith debate and where he's going to end up on, whether on Roadster or Omaha Beach. And I know there's been a little bit of discussion about whether you believe that the Beyer speed figure or the TimeformUS speed figure for Roadster, and if something like that factors into a discussion, or the difference in experience between these two horses, whereas Omaha Beach has had more seasoning. I just think he's supposed to go with the horse that has the best chance to win. And in my opinion, that's pretty clearly Omaha Beach. He's run the faster races. I think you can objectively say that, whichever speed figures you use. And he's been battle tested. He's beaten some of the top horses. He's beaten the best horses in Bob Baffert's stable. And I think there's still some lingering questions about how strong this Antonita Derby was, regardless of which speed figures you're using. And Roadster got such a great trip in that race, whereas Omaha Beach has had to overcome some things that I think he's the horse that is clearly the better chance to take in the Derby.
Yeah, I think you can. It's the Kentucky Derby. I think your loyalties kind of have to go out the window. I know Bob Baffert's put Mike Smith on a whole bunch of super great horses, but in this case, it's the Derby. You got to pick the horse you think's going to give you the best chance to win. And I'm with you on this one. I think that's clearly Omaha Beach. I love his tactical speed, and on a fast track, he didn't act up like he did in the Arkansas Derby where he had to get clear. So I just think he's the better choice personally.
Yeah, that's a good point about the track condition. Another race that came up pretty fast from this weekend for the 3-year-olds was the Grade 3 Lexington, which I was a little surprised about because watching this race from a visual standpoint, I wasn't blown away by these horses, but the figure came back pretty quick and it checks out. Owendale was the winner of this race, making a sweeping wide move around the far turn and perhaps catching his two main rivals slightly off guard because they began their moves a little bit later with that short stretch at Keeneland. They just didn't have the time to compensate for the advantage that Owendale took at the top of the stretch. Owendale's a horse that had never really run this well before, but he had hinted at having some ability in the past. This was a major step up for him, though.
It was. It was a step up for most of the top ones in here, I believe. And it's obviously, when you look at the past performances, it's a figure that gave me a little bit of pause. But, the more I looked at the worksheet, there was no real reason to downgrade it other than just not believing it. What gave me a little more confidence in the figure is there was a race run afterward, albeit a sprint. But it held with all the other races on the card. It was very consistent, the speed of the track, routes and sprints. So to just downgrade the Lexington on a whim because I just didn't believe it, especially for lightly raced, improving 3-year-olds, seemed to be a stretch. So I just let the clock tell the story. And, he got a 120, which is a big number. I don't think he has any shot of getting into the Derby, barring a lot of defections. Of course, the runner-up, I think, is on the bubble and might get into, if a few drop out along the way, as usually happens. But it was definitely a fast race, I think. Like I said, I gave it extra scrutiny because it kind of stuck out with most of the horses jumping up a bit, but I'm confident with it and I'm happy with the number.
Yeah, I think right now Another Twist of Fate is 22nd or 23rd on the list, so he needs a few horses to come out of the race to make it in. As far as the trip and the way that Javier Castellano rode Another Twist of Fate, this was his first ride aboard the horse in a race. I thought that he put him in a good spot coming to the top of the stretch. The pace did not develop in the same way that it was expected to. This was a race that featured a ton of speed coming in, and the fast pace just didn't develop. It's not like they were crawling up front, but it didn't gap the field out the way that you thought it might. And they were very bunched coming around the far turn. And while Florent Geroux did sacrifice a lot of ground loss, making that wide move on Owendale, he sort of caught everybody off guard. And Javier Castellano really didn't have an opportunity to get Another Twist of Fate into the clear at that point. And it just happened a little bit too late. Looking at the fractions of this race, they really did slow down between the 3/4 mark and the mile. That was just the slowest part of the race. And it was also the point in the race where Another Twist of Fate and even Sueño had nowhere to go in behind horses. So I think that allowed Owendale to make that move into the slowest part of the race and take that advantage for himself. Another Twist of Fate, he did take a step forward in this race. He and Sueño both earned career best speed figures, as a lot of horses did in this spot. And that will happen with 3-year-olds. They're just improving at this time of year. I still doubt the overall quality of these horses. I didn't think it was one of the stronger prep races, and maybe I have to reassess that now that the speed figure came back so high. But I still want to see some more of these horses. I feel like they've all ducked some of the top competition that's been out there.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if some of these maybe take a shot in the Preakness. The top 3 all ran fast enough, and we know that a whole bunch of horses usually opt for skipping the Preakness if they don't run very well in the Derby. So maybe 1 or 2 of these will show up. Maybe Another Twist of Fate will even get in. I wouldn't want to bet him in the Derby. Despite how fast he ran, it was still only a mile and a 16.3. So it's over kind of a quirky Keeneland track. So I think they have a future. I think we saw some real quality out of the top two, even the top three. But as far as Derby horses, even if they get in, I'm not going to go in that direction.
Yeah, I feel the same way about that. Earlier on Saturday at Keeneland, we saw another two-turn graded stakes race for older horses, which was, I think, probably a good comparison to the Lexington. This race went a little bit faster than Lexington, the Ben Ally, going 1.125 miles, and it was won by Bourbon Resolution, who was a long shot in this spot. He earned a 121 TimeformUS Speed figure, which kind of like the Lexington horses, represented a big step up off his prior races. This horse is a 4-year-old. He's had a bunch of stops and starts in his career, but it seems like Ian Wilkes finally has him in top form.
He does. This horse was actually a horse that I kind of liked. He has my favorite pattern, which is, it's several things involved. He was third race off the layoff, off of a lengthy size layoff. And he was it's also just a 4-year-old who's still rather lightly raced. And his figures were still getting better. He came back, he ran a 110. The second time out, he ran a 112 against Flame Away on a track that we had slightly speed favoring. So I was looking for a jump. I don't know if I was expecting quite this size of a jump. But, it puts him right up there with what we saw at Oaklawn on the older horses and, not quite grade 1 level with what we saw in Dubai in the Santa Anita handicap. But you'd probably have to put him in your top 10 older horses right now after that performance.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue with that just because there's not a whole lot of depth out there. And a number like this certainly puts him in that conversation. I do think this race is notable for the horses that just didn't show up. I don't know what Flame Away's excuse was because he got the right pace situation in this race. It's not like they were flying up front. The pace was fairly moderate, and he just came up completely empty at the top of the stretch. He had absolutely nothing left for the end of this race. After running pretty well in his first couple of races as a 4-year-old, this was a step in the wrong direction for Flame Away. And also Salamini, who was coming back, trying to get back to his better races as a 3-year-old here. He just didn't really have it. He was probably not in the most comfortable position racing on the inside throughout, and it looked like Brian Hernandez was trying to squeeze through a hole that wasn't really there at the 8th pole. But that said, Salamini was beaten a long way in this race, and those were the two that I think were expected to issue a real challenge, and they just didn't put forth their top efforts. Nonetheless, he was second. He did kind of validate that really high speed figure that he earned at Turfway Park the time before, which we had discussed a little bit. He'd gotten to 123 in the Kentucky Cup Classic last month, and that form held as he moved to dirt for this race. So I think that does give some validation to the number that Bourbon Resolution ran winning this race. Still, though, wasn't the toughest grade 3 that we've seen.
No, you make a good point about Salamini. He's the kind of horse better should be avoiding like the plague, to be honest. He ran a 122 back as a 2-year-old. As a 3-year-old, he was never able to top a 117, which he ran in the Rebel and again in the Derby. And this year, in now 4 tries, he's yet to eclipse a 114. So he's just a horse who hasn't developed at all. Maybe it's physical issues. Maybe he just developed early. But as as he moves on and the competition gets tougher, I want no parts of him going forward. And just wanted to mention him. These are the kind of horses that are always going to take money because of the barn and because of the early success that you really want to avoid and take a stand against.
Well, there might be a real lack of depth in the older male division on dirt, but that's definitely not the case in the older female division on the turf, where we saw Rushing Fall win the Grade 1 Jenny Wiley on Saturday. I think this was the last of the stakes races on Saturday at Keeneland. She was able to control this race on the lead, and I think that was really to her benefit because she seems to relax in a way that she never did when she had to rate behind horses. Now that they've sort of turned her into this front runner, it just seems to have brought the best out of her. And I know she only won this race by a length, but she never looked like a loser of this race. She was just in command throughout.
Yeah, she did. It was a well-measured length. She, as you said, she rated kindly on the lead. She was up front, but she wasn't going overly fast. We actually had the race at only a 114 after 6 furlongs, and so she was flying home at she finished the final time figure in 121, and that just makes it really tough on the closers. You'd have to watch horses like Rimska and On the Moon Again, 2 other Chad Brown horses who tried to close into that pace, but against probably a little bit better quality stablemate weren't able to get it done. But, up against other fields, they're going to run well. Both got figures as good or even a little bit better than Rushing Fall in here, and just a really solid race. I mean, I think it's a Grade 1, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a Grade 1 now.
And I think it lived up to its billing here for fillies and mares, 1 123s and 124s. That's really good this time of year.
Yeah, Chad Brown was just a neck away from completing the trifecta in this race, and he would have been doing that 2 years in a row because he also did that last year with Sister Charlie winning this race. Rushing Fall, I think the major question for her moving forward is what is her ideal distance? Does Chad Brown focus on races at a flat mile, like the Just a Game, and I guess the First Lady going all the way to the Fall? I don't know where he runs her in between. I have some doubts still that she's a horse that would be able to go 1.25 miles, or even in a race like the Beverly D going 1 mile and 3/16. I'm not sure that's her ideal distance. I do think a little bit shorter is best for her. But if she can get into a situation where she controls the pace and just can sprint home in front of the closers, maybe she can go longer. The way that she relaxed in this race really does give me some hope that maybe she can make that transition, whereas I had a lot of doubts about that when she was a 3-year-old. Just watching the early portion of this race, I always love to see when a horse just pricks their ears forward for the entire race and is just like out for a stroll. She never looked like she was fully extended. And even when they got into the stretch, when Javier Castellano was asking her for her best, she briefly put her ears up again, like she wasn't even sure if she had to give her all. And then Rimska and Got Stormy were ranging up on both sides of her, and she really pinned her ears back and finished off the race well. But the way that she did this race gives me hope that maybe she can stretch out in the future. I'll be interested to see what Chad Brown chooses to do because he obviously has so much firepower in his barn. I'm sure he has top fillies for all of these races already.
Yeah, it'll be the real thing with her is that would be interesting to see if she really gets challenged up front. That didn't really happen in here, and see how she responds to that. But everything I like that I saw on Saturday, I liked.
Yeah, and Rimska, she proved that she can do it in a Grade 1 race, where I think that was the real question before this. And On the Moon, again, ran fine in this race. She was a little bit wide. She's a horse that definitely will appreciate going longer in the future. I think that is really where she'll be able to show her best. This mile, this 16th distance, was just a little bit short for her. Moving on to the Colts, on Friday, we saw the Makers 46 mile. This is also a Grade 1 race. And Delta Prince, who I believe was the slight favorite at the end of wagering, ran them all down in the stretch. I think he was actually last coming around the far turn. But again, under Javier Castellano, who had a big weekend, ran down this field, beating his main rival, Raging Bull, who didn't show up in this race, as well as the long shot, Clyde's Image. Delta Prince had run well in his prior start in the Pegasus Turf Invitational, and the cutback to a mile probably worked in his favor. I think he's a horse that really appreciates this flat mile distance.
Yeah, this was a so-so race. Unlike the Philly and Mare race, this one came back slow on my figures, only a 121 for the winner, who was a favorite, as you mentioned. Raging Bull was a horse I think you could take a stand against. It's always hard to go against Chad Brown, but he had never run particularly fast as a 3-year-old, and I think this was a very big step up in class. He'll probably run a little bit better going forward, but I wasn't a huge fan of his last year. I think he took advantage of some easier spots and against older for the first time. I'm just not a huge fan of this one. He did run a 119, which is his best, but Delta Prince did what he had to do. The pace was solid. It wasn't overly fast. I think we had the 3/4 mile coded red, but the early fractions were just considered average. And, he got the job done. But again, not a strong field, in my opinion, particularly for a Grade 1.
Yeah, this was a race where I think just looking at the pace figures doesn't tell the whole story because the race flow, it played out like a complete pace collapse situation. I mean, they just completely inverted in the last part of the race, whereas the two leaders who opened up quite a lead on the backstretch, they had absolutely nothing for the stretch drive. And Delta Prince, who for a long time looked like he was going to get nothing in this race. I mean, Javier Castellano was kind of riding him around the far turn and he was going nowhere. And then once they got into that long stretch at Keeneland, as the race came apart, he was able to run them all down just through sheer persistence. Raging Bull, given that situation, I thought he probably should have finished second in this race at the very least, and he wasn't able to produce that same kick that we saw out of him as a 3-year-old. I think the real question for Raging Bull is he had done his best work against straight 3-year-olds last year, and I don't think we yet know how strong that group of runners was. And it remains to be seen if he can transition that form to be the Grade 1 level against the top older horses in this division. Like you were saying, this was not the fastest race, and maybe these aren't even the best horses that are out there. So his poor effort here is a little bit of a concern. I do want to mention the track was rated good for this race. Keeneland had taken plenty of rain. I don't know what the track condition rating for in TimeformUS PPs will be for this race on a scale of 1 to 10. I don't know how soft it actually was. The final time seems fast enough for a good track, but that might have played into it a little bit, and that might have influenced the way that the race unfolded. The horses that were going fast up front, or relatively fast, that they just might not have liked the going. As Heart to Heart probably prefers a firmer turf course, and he, of course, his career has come to an end after this race. I think it's the right call with Heart to Heart to retire him, because he's just not putting forth competitive efforts anymore.
No, yeah, I saw that news as well. I'll be sad to see him go, but I agree with you. It's time. As far as the track condition rating, just looking at my worksheet, we don't have it in the charts yet, much to my dismay, but I think it's probably a 6 or 7 just off the top of my head. So not overly wet. It wasn't a too bad, of course, but it certainly wasn't firm. It wasn't one of those 8, 9, or 10 tracks for sure.
Yeah, and I think the way that the race unfolded would corroborate that. The other stakes race that we want to discuss from Saturday was the Giants Causeway, which was won by Morticia, a field of filly turf sprinters. Morticia is a really cool horse. I think this was her 7th stakes victory. She hasn't participated in that many graded stakes like this one, but I'm not even sure if this was a graded stakes. I think it was. But she just is rock solid. She always shows up with a solid effort. And this 5.5 furlong distance really seems to be perfect for her. She got the right trip in this race. I mean, she was in the clear, really, and I got the jump on her main rival, who was Excessive Spending. But she's just a cool horse who shows up every time.
Yeah, she kind of runs the same figure all the time. And not that I knew this, I looked it up while you were talking. It's not a graded race, just for FYI for our listeners. Yeah, Morticia pretty much runs the same race all the time. She's always right there. She ran a 112 here, which is, solid enough. She'd probably have a tough time stepping up in the graded company. She beat Surrender Now, who I thought ran well and is probably worth watching for Peter Miller. It was her first race since the summer, I believe. So she's a fast one who probably would prefer to be a little closer to the front. I didn't put a whole lot of time into this race. I watched it last night when I was catching up because I didn't get to see this one live. So anything else you want to add? It's probably on you here.
No, I didn't have any stake in this race, so I kind of just watched it after the fact. I didn't handicap it beforehand, but watching it, I did feel like Excessive Spending should have won this race. And she broke so well, and it seemed like Leparoux had a plan to take her to the back of the pack, as if maybe he was riding to instructions. Maybe he just thinks that's the way that she produces her best laid kick. But it's not like they were going a crazy fast pace up front. And I thought that he took her too far back, considering how well she broke. He should have just played the break and allowed her to run up with where Morticia was, because Excessive Spending has a real potent late kick on her. And she almost got there at the end, even though she had so much ground to make up. I just thought this was kind of a missed opportunity for that horse. But I think that these two are pretty close in terms of ability, Excessive Spending and Morticia. Not the fastest horses out there, but they're just honest and they're fairly consistent. A couple other races to discuss from Keeneland on Friday were both allowance races, one on the dirt and one on the turf. We saw Wentz in an allowance race going 6 furlongs, run a 121 TimeformUS speed figure. This horse was making his first start off a trainer switch to Tyler Service, who I believe was making his training debut here. I think he's John Service's son, and this was his first starter. And Wentz really ran a career best race for him.
Interesting. I just noticed in the chart it was John Tyler Service. I assume there was some kind of relation there, but obviously it is. So thanks for looking that up. I'm just going to throw a blanket over the Service guys and say I guess now nothing surprises me for the father or the son when it comes to figure making. It was definitely a big effort. He got passed in the stretch. According to the chart, he was ahead back. I was a little leery of giving this race such a big figure with the top two, both running 121s. But with the big gap back to third and the track was pretty consistent throughout the day, the number is what it is, a solid 121. And maybe either of these top two would future in stakes company.
Yeah, and I think also the pace probably that because they weren't that fast up front, and often front runners, when they're able to set relatively slow fractions, they can run career tops. And I think that's what happened with the top two here. Also, the track condition might have played into it a little bit, but a fast race nonetheless. And I wouldn't be surprised if these horses could step up into stakes company next time. The other horse to discuss from Friday was Demarchelier. This was not one of the faster races, but this horse is just a 3-year-old making a second career start. And I wanted to highlight this race because this is a horse that I know is well thought of from the Chad Brown camp. And he's got a ton of pedigree. He's one of these horses, kind of like Newspaper of Record, who was purchased overseas and brought over to run here. He's by Dubawi, out of a very classy dams family. There's Group 1 winners in Europe in this female family. And I just thought this horse did it the right way. Javier Castellano never really had to take out the stick on him, maybe gave him one crack around the eighth pole, but it was mostly a hand ride. And I just like what I've seen out of this horse in his first two career starts.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly the same thing. I don't think this is a race, at least for the winner, that you want to put a whole lot of stock in the figure. I think it was a race where they knew they had the field over a barrel. The rider did exactly what he had to do to win and nothing more. And it's the kind of horse that wouldn't shock me at all if he popped a 110 the next time he runs against tougher competition, probably trying stakes for the first time.
Yeah, and I was looking back at his past performances, actually. I forgot who he beat in his debut. That horse he actually ran down in that race at Aqueduct was Seismic Wave, who has since gone on to win a stakes for Bill Mott and Judd Mott. So that has actually been a pretty productive race. And DeMarchelier is a horse that I think probably could step forward in future weeks and months, kind of reminding me of a horse like Raging Bull, who also ran a very impressive race, I believe, in his second start at Keeneland last year. Moving on to Oaklawn Park to wrap up the stakes races from there. There was a ton of stakes action this weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. We'll kind of go a little bit in reverse order, starting with the Apple Blossom on Sunday. This was the most exciting race to watch, no doubt about that. Quite a battle to the finish between Midnight Bisou and Escape Clause. I was kind of rooting for Escape Clause in this race because she was just trying so hard to win this race.
Yeah, she's such a cool story, having run at a lot of those smaller tracks in Canada before moving to California and winning, going to California and winning some big races there. Just a really neat story. But Midnight Bisou, she has just proven so tough. She just keeps getting the job done. Still has question marks over her head as far as if she can win longer, but she's almost impossible to beat at the mile and a 16th, it seems. The big question mark here is Elate and what's going on with her. I'm curious how you think about this. The more I look back at that race that she ran against Abel Tasman last year, it just seems like maybe that race was so big it took something out of both of the top two there, because neither have run very well since at all. And Elate just didn't look the same to me on the track Sunday.
Yeah, I'm of two minds about Elate. On one hand, the trip didn't work out for her in this race because she did break slowly, and this was not a race that featured a fast pace by any means. She's never going to beat a horse like Midnight Bisou from behind. She's not going to close that horse down because Midnight Bisou has such an effective late kick. So I never thought Elate was really in position to win this race, watching it unfold. Both of her starts I believe she's a 5-year-old mare now. Both of her starts this year, I don't think they've been terrible. I saw somebody on Twitter ask if she should be retired after this, and I think that's a little premature. She's run fine in these races. I still feel like she's a horse that really would appreciate stretching back out in distance to a mile and an eighth, a mile and a quarter. She won the Delaware Handicap last year. I really think that's the right kind of race for her, where she can be a little bit more forwardly placed and use her stamina. Whereas she's just not going to grind down a horse like Midnight Beast, who's so effective with her turn of foot going a mile and a 16th. As for the personal ensign speed figure from last year, I agree with you. It was the right number on the day. Both she and Abel Tasman ran exceptional races at Saratoga that day. But I'm not really the reproduce form in these two Oaklawn. Given the circumstances, said should she have better? Probably, but not willing to totally give up on her yet. She's probably not at the division anymore. Given the right set of circumstances and the right, I still think see her win some to her grade 1 stakes down the line.
Yeah, it is interesting. Obviously, distance nowhere real run that this time. I don't think that we've had any graded stakes at a mile and an eighth. Not the big money ones anyway. What really alarms me is the gait issue she had again. That just always seems to be not a good sign when horses start breaking slow. I could be dead wrong about her, and maybe she'll rebound, but she's always going to be a short price. So she's the one I'm kind of looking for negatives more than positives as she goes forward.
No, that's fair. And I think with Midnight Bisou, as you were saying, she is so good going a mile and a 16th. I even think maybe a one-turn mile and a 16th, like what we see in the Ogden Phipps, would be really perfect for her. She's just kind of tailor-made for that race. I've even thought in the past that she could probably turn back and win going 7 furlongs because she does have that turn of foot that makes her so dangerous in these dirt races. We'll see if they try to go a mile and an eighth with her again. I know she couldn't quite do it a few times last year, but maybe as a more mature 4-year-old, that won't be as much of an issue. And maybe she's just a better horse now. So that also might erase that concern. She hasn't faced Monomoy Girl yet, and we'll see where Monomoy Girl is at when she actually does return, if she's improved as well. But this is there's some in this division, and just adding a to the mix makes it even more interesting. I don't know if they'll take her to the East Coast eventually, or if they'll stick with some West Coast races or Midwest. But it seems like she can do anything at this point.
Yeah, she is. She's just something. They even tried her on turf, if I remember right, and she ran well there. Right, she ran very well. Not quite as good as she's run on dirt, but she certainly ran well. So I'll be rooting for her wherever she runs.
Yeah, I don't know if we can say the same about the quality of the older horses that we saw in the Oaklawn Handicap on Saturday. This is a race that it had all the red flags of a race that might just not be that strong. The way that they came home just wasn't that visually impressive. And the fact that they all hit the wire at the same time, I believe there were 5 horses within a length of each other. That's often indicative of a race that's just not of very high quality. Quip got the job done, and Quip's a nice horse. It's just, I don't think these are really major players, at least at the grade 1 level in this division. I know the Oaklawn Handicap is a race with some history. This was not one of the strongest runnings of it.
Yeah, I wonder if the Santa Anita Handicap getting postponed maybe made the field a little weaker. Maybe you'd got a horse or two from there shipping in for this kind of money. But as you say, it wasn't a strong race, and it's really not a surprise. Looking at the past performances before the race, I mean, it certainly didn't give the look of a race that was going to be a strong one. Got a 120, which is, more a grade 3 figure than I don't even remember if this is a grade 1 or grade 2 at this point. I know it's not a grade 3, but that's what it looked like on paper, and that's what it looked like on the track.
Yeah, and I do want to discuss the flow of this race compared to the Arkansas Derby, because they were run on the same card relatively close to each other. And the fractions of this race, early on, they were going a little bit slower than the Arkansas Derby. The opening quarter and half of the Arkansas Derby were actually faster than this Oaklawn Handicap. But whereas the Arkansas Derby kind of slowed down in the middle, the leaders in this Oaklawn Handicap kicked on a little bit halfway through the race. And I think that allowed the race to come apart a little bit, because given the way that the Arkansas Derby set up, it would have been hard to imagine a horse making the kind of move that Lone Sailor did in this race. And I think the fact that they sped up the middle portion of this Oaklawn Handicap allowed Lone Sailor to rally from as far back as he did. Within the context of this race, I think you can make the argument that Lone Sailor perhaps ran the best race, a little bit unlucky to lose, but a horse like Lone Sailor is always going to be at the mercy in these races. I'm not sure really where he's going to be.
Right. Races are interesting with these tapes. I mean, probably 85% of the races I make figures for have a increasing or decreasing flow to them. As you say, this one had a high where this was slower, went fast, and then down late. And the Arkansas Derby the opposite, where it was a little faster, he slowed down and again late. And I think these are ones that are worth analyzing, and particularly as the horses start running back and use the charts and just get a better idea for who the flow of the race actually helped and hurt, because it's not as cut and dry as most races that we see.
And I've got to ask you, are you having any second thoughts about that figure in the New Orleans Handicap? Because Lone Sailor did come back and run 21 points higher in this race. And I think we kind of expected that to happen. I don't know if multiple horses doing that would affect the determination about that race. But it is something that I think we're all watching to see how that race actually does stack up when horses do come back.
Oh, definitely. It's one I'm tracking. I think he's the first one that's actually run back.
Yeah.
And I'm not surprised at all, as I'm sure you aren't, that he jumped up. I didn't expect him to run a 98. So that's one that's definitely on the radar, and perhaps will definitely be reevaluated after a few more run back.
The biggest figure of the weekend, I believe, was run by Matoli in the Count Fleet, which should come as no surprise because Matoli has just been laying down these fast speed figures for his entire career. He ran this race the same way that he's been running his big figures in the past. The early pace was not particularly fast. I believe the fractions are color-coded blue in our charts. And he just was able to close off his own fractions. He put Whitmore in a difficult position because Whitmore doesn't really want to be chasing a horse like this, and he just couldn't match strides with Mitoli's finishing power in the lane.
Yeah, Mitoli, he's an interesting horse. I think the rider, I think it was Luis Saez on Whitmore, did everything he had to do to try to beat him. He was at such a tactical disadvantage. There wasn't really any other speed. So he kind of took it to him early. And Mitoli just does what he's always done up to this point, where he just kind of shook him off and was able to pull away late. He's a really interesting horse in that he never seems to get challenged on the front end, but he also has that running style where I'm not convinced he's a 6 furlong, that he couldn't go further. This horse could probably go 7, even a 1-turn mile the way he's going. I mean, he rates really nicely on the front end, finishes his races strong, and I'm really curious to see where they're going to show up with this guy next, be it, Churchill or even a race like the Met Mile. Wouldn't shock me.
Yeah, there is that Churchill Down Stakes going 7 furlongs. And as you mentioned, the Met Mile, I think that has to be in the conversation. I really don't know how far he wants to go because he has done all of his work at 6 furlongs so far. And we've seen him be so effective at that distance and finish so powerfully at that distance. I wonder if he can do it going farther. And I also wonder if he can do it with a different pace situation. I can't remember a top horse in recent memory who has gotten so many favorable pace setups. And part of that is just the fact that he's quicker than his competition in the early going, but he also hasn't faced a really fast speed horse like an XY Jet. He hasn't had to fend off a horse like that or stalk a horse like that in any of his top races. And I think that's going to be the real test for Mitoli because the TimeformUS speed figures, they don't really flatter this horse as much as a final time number like the buyers do, because almost all of his races, we've downgraded the TimeformUS speed figure off what his final time figure was. I think his final time figure in this race was a 132, and his TimeformUS speed figure was just down to a 127. And that's happened in almost all of his races because he's gotten such favorable pace setups. I'm not sure that he's going to be able to do that with a real pace rival in the future, but he hasn't encountered one yet. So I think it just remains to be seen if he can handle it.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's almost like he hypnotizes the field in the running slow. I mean, when you say slow, some of his fractions, I mean, we're talking in the low hundreds, which, any decent claimer can really do, but it just seems like nobody ever wants to challenge him, despite the fact he's never really been challenged. So I just, like you said, I'm not sure what to make of him. I do like how he rates on the front end. And that's why I almost say I think he'll be better at longer distances where he'd be able to relax just like he does now, as opposed to a 6 furlong race where somebody really takes it to him and just makes him really work. So he's definitely a bit of an enigma to me still. He runs fast, but like you said, we're always downgrading his races. And these horses are always just really, really tough until they get that first acid test, which he hasn't had yet.
Yeah, and I'm only being so picky about this, or nitpicky, I should say, because I see a lot of people kind of proclaiming this horse as the best sprinter in the country at this point. And I think it's a little bit premature because we haven't seen him overcome adversity and we haven't seen him do it against, I mean, he beat Whitmore in this race, but Whitmore never really had a chance to beat this horse. As you were saying, he did everything he could to give him a chance, but Whitmore is not the kind of horse that wants to be a pace presser. That's just taking him out of his best game. It's taking away his strength, which is his finishing speed. And I just want to see Mitoli do it under a different set of circumstances before I really say that he's the best sprinter in the country. I know his speed figures are impressive, but I want to see more out of this horse before I kind of concede that he's a leader for an Eclipse Award or anything like that. And he's got to face Grade 1 company as well. We haven't seen that out of him either. So there's a lot more for questions for Mitoli to answer, as well as whether or not he can stay sound. We haven't mentioned that yet, but this has a horse who's had a lot of physical issues and hasn't always been able to stay on the racetrack. So hopefully he can put some races back to back. But I think we're both interested to see how he does moving forward. We saw an Oaks prep on a Friday at Oaklawn Park in the Fantasy. I think this was the final Oaks prep that we'll see. And Lady Apple got the best of Motion Emotion, who really ran well. Again, Motion Emotion setting an honest pace up front, and she just couldn't quite hold on. Lady Apple has been improving recently for Steve Asmussen. I thought she got a great trip in this race, and she's just taken a step forward since they stretched her out in distance.
Yeah, Friday, I just want to give a shout out to my friends Bob and Lee Butler, who own a piece of Aura Moore with Starlight Ladies Racing. And, so I had a great day with them, and we watched this race. I watched it with them, and it actually turned out to be a really fast race for the division. I don't want to say fast generally, but compared to what we've been seeing, it's one of the faster preps that we've seen. Motion emotion as usual, as she's done her last 3 times, set a solid pace, and just I think she's right at her distance limit. She's gotten run down twice, albeit Lady Apple just had an absolutely perfect trip in here as Brill kind of took it to motion emotion. Lady Apple just sat inside, never lost one step of ground. I actually watched this one outside, and it was tough to see who it was coming up the rail, but you could see that there was someone coming in. Easily got through as the top 2 stayed off the rail. So the figure's good. I'm not sure Motion Emotion's a horse that wants a 1.125 that we'd see in the Oaks, so she'd certainly add some pace. But Lady Apple, dream trip and all, I assume she's going there and will probably be a contender.
Yeah, Motion Emotion to me seems like a horse that would probably be better suited to a race like the Acorn, going a 1-turn mile. I think that would allow her to make use of her speed and possibly get the distance. Because the Kentucky Oaks, I know it's alluring to take part in that day and that weekend, but I'm just not sure it's the right race for her. She's got the points. I assume she'll go, like all the others will, because it is kind of a wide open race this year. And you never know what's going to unfold from a pace perspective. And maybe she gets the right situation on that occasion. I'm just a little skeptical of that. As for Lady Apple, it's funny. I remember seeing this horse as a 2-year-old last year. I think she ran in the Astoria at Belmont Park. And I remember thinking at the time, what's a daughter of Curlin doing in these like 4.5 and 5 furlong races? And she actually ran fine in a few of them, but she's really taken her game to the next level since they stretched her out in distance, which I guess shouldn't be a major surprise. And I'm interested to see how they bet the Kentucky Oaks now, because we've seen this race and we saw the Ashland earn respectable speed figures relative to the other fillies out there. Both of those races came up faster than Bellafina Santa Anita Oaks. And Bellafina is probably going to be a prohibitive favorite in the Kentucky Oaks. I think it's a more wide open race than that, though, because there are some fillies that have earned speed figures that could put them in the winner's circle without any improvement.
Yeah, I think you could even throw the Gulfstream Oaks in that. I think that was even a faster race.
You're right about that.
Off the top of my head. So it's a race I'm looking forward to betting. As a bettor, I hope Motion Emotion does go, because I always like races where you have plenty of pace. I think it makes for better betting races instead of these processions we get with smaller fields. That's unlikely to happen anyway in a race like the Oaks and later the next day like the Derby. We almost always have pace. But a horse like Motion Emotion is a quality speed and will really make it tough on the favorites that like to be up closer. And, I don't want to knock Lady Apple too much because she ran fast. She had no problem staying in behind horses where she'd won most of her last couple right up on the lead. So she showed a little bit of a new asset there to be able to rate and stay behind horses. And I definitely think she's one to watch. And she's the kind of horse that could easily sneak up and go off at 12 or 15 to 1, given the reputation of some of the others in here that's probably not deserved.
Yeah, I agree with you about that. It's going to be an interesting betting race for sure, the Kentucky Oaks. Couple other allowance races from Oaklawn Park the past weekend, both for 3-year-olds that we should discuss. One was on Friday, where Warrior's Charge just decimated a field. It seemed like a pretty classy field going in, and he just dominated throughout. This horse for Brad Cox has really taken a step forward in his past couple of starts. They changed his running style around when he broke his maiden. They sent him to the lead for the first time, whereas he had been closing from off the pace in his prior races. And it just seems like it's given him this new level of confidence where he just doesn't allow anybody else to get into the races. It's not like he was walking on the lead in this race. He just laid down legitimate fractions and kept going. This was a pretty impressive performance from Warrior's Charge.
Yeah, he's really turned a corner. I've got to see him his last 2 times in person, and I'll be honest, it's a rare day that I bet a 3-2 shot. But he was actually not favored for a while, as Soldado, the Todd Pletcher horse who we've talked about on this show before, was. And while he's solid enough, I mean, I didn't think he was anywhere in the class that I saw of Warrior's Charge on Rebel Day. And I couldn't wait to bet this guy. And it's one of the easiest bets that you'll get as a guy rooting a horse home. I mean, you didn't even have to root. This was over before they even came off the turn. I'm curious to see where they go with this guy next. I asked Mary Rampolini, who works at Oaklawn for DRF, and she said, I thought maybe he'd go in that Oaklawn Invitational, but while it's still on the table, it's probably not likely he's going to go somewhere else. So maybe the Peter Pan. Hard to say where he'll show up, but he's certainly going to be one to deal with. He looks like a new horse these last few, and he's fast, and he's going to be a part of the pace, and he finishes strong.
Yeah, I don't know where they should take this horse. I know moving on a little bit, there's a race like the Matt Winn at Churchill or the Dwyer at Belmont. I don't get the sense he's really a Belmont Stakes kind of horse, so I don't know if they'd really target the Triple Crown races with him. It's a little bit late for that. He's also a son of Munnings without a lot of dam side pedigree to speak of whatsoever. So he's kind of outrunning his pedigree already by going this distance. But what I've seen from him in the past couple of races, this is a serious runner. He's run fast and he just does it with ease. I mean, Florent Geroux never even asked him for running the stretch. He just did it all in his own power. This is a good horse. And as you were saying, I'll be interested to see wherever he shows up, how he runs. On Saturday, on the sloppy conditions, we saw Pyron win an allowance race going 6 furlongs. This horse, we didn't discuss his debut on the podcast. I know we had discussed that Doug O'Neill horse, whose name I'm forgetting now, who I think was also entered in this race and scratched. But Pyron had run a similar speed figure a few weeks prior, and he came back and validated that number in this allowance win, and then some. He actually improved. This is a pretty decent sprinter for Steve Asmussen.
Yeah, it sure is. The horse you were talking about for O'Neill is Landeskog, who scratched out. But yeah, Jack Van Berg was in here, who's run well enough. The Roatan, I think is how you say it, the Jerry Hollendorfer horse who made some noise, ran second in the Delmar Futurity to a game winner, was actually in here and the heavy favorite. But, Pyron, he won it fairly easily. He showed a little new dimension. He stayed right up there on the pace and drew off. He backed up that 111 speed figure he ran last time with a 114 in here. So solid enough. I'll leave the breeding part to you as how far he would probably want to go. But this was a strong field. Roatan challenged him and wound up finishing well back. You've said it all, ran good for Steve Asmussen, who was winning everything else that day. So he did run 1-2 in here. Doug O'Neill also had Mason Dixon, who ran a 104. So it was just a good, strong allowance field, and he did it easily.
Yeah, I would imagine Steve Asmussen will probably take the Mitole route with this horse and point to a race like the Chick Lang on Preakness Day. I think that's probably a good fit for him. But this horse seems like a talented sprinter. He's a son of Candy Ride, and I know people have asked me about that weird action that Vekoma has. That can be that can be something that a lot of the progeny of Candy Ride have, and this horse does have a little bit of that paddle going on, not quite as pronounced as Vekoma does, but he's got that way of moving. It works for him though, and he's clearly a talented sprinter. We'll discuss some races from Santa Anita and Aqueduct to wrap up the show today. There were 2 stakes races at Santa Anita last weekend. Neither of them were top class races, but I think they're worth discussing. Painting Corners won the Misdirection. I think this was one of 2 Misdirection stakes that took place across the country, because there was also a Misdirection stakes at Aqueduct this past weekend. But Painting Corners ran a relatively fast race. The main thing I have to say about this race is that her performance flatters Belvoir Bay, who easily beat her in her prior starts.
Yeah, Belvoir Bay, I think we've talked about her a few times, so I don't want to waste too much time on her. But Painting Corner certainly didn't mind getting away from her. She probably also appreciated not having to go down the hill, as they've suspended those races for the time being, at least at Santa Anita. She's a horse that outside of a Belvoir Bay is going to be very tough to beat at 5 furlongs. She got a nice 119 speed figure. She had won the last time at Delmar going 5 furlongs with a 117. She's fast, but she doesn't have to have the lead, so she's always going to be dangerous in fields like this.
Yeah, and the other race that took place this past weekend was the Tokyo City Cup, which was won by Campaign. This is a horse that I've had a thing for a while. I actually remember his debut at Saratoga a few years ago when he ran this actually remarkable race behind Lone Sailor, who I think he was a 10 or 11th like winner that day, going 7 furlongs at Saratoga. But Campaign had put in this deceptively strong stretch run where he was just finishing significantly faster than anybody else on that entire card in a sloppy track at Saratoga. It's taken him a while to figure things out, and unsurprisingly, it's turned out that he wants to run all day. This race was just a perfect fit for him because he handles both surfaces, dirt and turf, and he really wants to go that 1.5 mile distance, and he just wore this field down in the stretch.
Yeah, he came out of the big cap, which was, so he was coming back on a quick turnaround. He really had no shot whatsoever in that race, given the slow fractions. We had him all coated in blue, but he still ran a 120 TimeformUS speed figure. So it's very possible, as good as this horse did on turf, that he's actually a better horse on dirt. The problem he's going to find is finding races that are at this kind of distance. There's just not a whole lot of them out there. If he went to ship east on Belmont Day, he could run into Brooklyn where he'd be a strong contender, I'm sure. I don't have speed figures for this one yet. My West Coast assistant hasn't done them. I just gave a quick look and estimated it's going to be around 119. It could easily be 3 or 4 points higher. I don't think it would be any lower. That would be a real stretch. So he ran a good race. He beat Beachview, who's more or less a turf horse who probably tried just because of the distance and ran okay, but really there wasn't much else in here.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The Brooklyn seems like the perfect target for a horse like this, but I wouldn't count him out going 1.25 miles in the future, because he really can use his stamina going that distance. He just needs a more favorable pace setup. He's really a horse who's dependent on pace. And as you were saying, he did not get that in the Santa Anita handicap. So he would just need a race with a little bit more speed. There were a couple of stakes at Aqueduct past weekend, actually more than a couple, but we'll discuss 2 of them. The Top Flight on Saturday, I thought, was a solid race, only a 6-horse field, but for a listed stakes race, I thought it drew an interesting crew. Another broad stepping up for Todd Pletcher got the job done here. She got some pace to close into because Frosty and one of her main rivals just sort of ran off on the front end. And Manny Franco, I thought, gave this horse a perfect ride, saving ground for much of the way and coming through right at the end. The distance is really the key for another broad. She just seems to want to go as far as they write races, in the 1 1/8 worked to her advantage on this occasion.
Yeah, solid enough speed figure here, 114 for both her and the top 2. I think this is where you have to be careful with our speed figures. We actually gave Frosty Ann a 115, and we even temper that down quite a bit because she ran off. We don't give her all that extra credit for going fast like she did. But I think she's a horse that's just better at about 1 mile. I think 1 1/8 is too far for her. So when horses run off like this, kind of take that speed figure with a grain of salt. We use an algorithm that fits the horses most of the time, but we can't nail every one. And this is a horse I wouldn't want if she tried 1 1/8 against this same group, despite having a better figure. There's no reason to think she could beat him.
Frosty Ann's a funny horse, and I was actually tweeting before the race. I didn't know what to expect from her because she actually walked in this time. And if you're familiar with her, she's the typically hold the start by 3, 4, 5 minutes. She refuses to gate, and this time right in, and she was ready to run because she's often the early go. But she's in form right now, and she's a remarkable Frosty Ann for her. She's back with company next. I think it could be very dangerous, going a bit shorter. Sunday, we had a couple of races. One of them was a race by Fort for Todd Pletcher. He was facing New York on this occasion. He had faced Open in his debut at Gulfstream Park, and that was a fast race exiting, and he made that number with this maiden win on Monday.
Yeah, he did a 116 TimeformUS figure, which is huge for a maiden special race, let alone New York breds. But the car, it was really make figure. I didn't have issues with. Played it straight through. I think the number is for the red ran a nice 11, and he was well clear third. I think he'll be his maiden very soon, particularly if he's against New York. It's because these kind of figures you just very often in this class. But I think they're good. I'll be curious to see where Todd sees this horse next. He has a lot of with him being bred.
And on a podcast, we had about that maiden was won by Shannon at Gulfstream at a 120 TimeformUS speed figure. I know you would say at the time that's you wanted to monitor forward because it almost seemed fast to possibly be true. But out of that race, we've seen Bodie come back to finish in the Florida Derby, valid a number. We saw Abandoned Woods recently breaking Keeneland, running a little more, but he was visually impressive doing it. Now we've seen this horse, Worth, come back and run even faster. So we haven't seen come back yet. The race has held up. That one year, it seems like a number.
Yeah, it's definitely one that I tracked, and even the who ran next to last that day came back and third 10 points faster. So I have no doubt the figure's good. It's kind of the reason I side with the one. I don't just like to knock races back just because they too fast. And most of the time it works out. It doesn't always do it, but particularly with 3-year-olds, you really have to be careful about being too conservative. Also, you'll just get horses ratings that are way too low. It would have been easy to do it in the race, particularly with a first-time starter getting a 120, but I think it's worked out well and clearly what I'd call a key race.
Yeah, sometimes races are actually as fast as they seem. The final race we'll discuss on this podcast was also from Sunday at Aqueduct. It's the Plenty of Grace, going, I believe, a mile on the turf course there. 55 won this race for Chad Brown. She was actually one of 2 Chad Brown trained Peter Brandt owned horses in this race, along with her stablemate Thais, who didn't show up. 55 has just been ultra consistent over the past year for Chad Brown, mostly focusing on New York bred and listed races. But she's really turned into a winning machine, and she got right back to her winning ways in this race. Interested to see where she goes from here, because Chad Brown has kind of been resistant to step her up against graded stakes company in the past, but at this level, she's just really dangerous.
Yeah, she only got a 114 in here, but again, I think that's more a product of the field. Chad doesn't like his horses being up on the pace for the most part. I was talking to Andy Serling, and he was mentioning this. So, the horse did what she had to do. She was always going to win this race. She was 2-5. So I'm not a big fan of saying, oh, well, she could have ran faster, but this horse could run faster. I'm not going to hold a 114 against her when she steps up in class next time. It doesn't mean she's a cinch. The waters are about to get tougher, but she certainly showed she had this field over a barrel.
Yeah, I would assume they'll try some graded stakes with her because she just is in very good form right now. But as a New York bred, she always has those stakes races against her own type to fall back on in case those graded stakes attempts don't work out. So plenty of options with 55. Those are all the races that we wanted to discuss this weekend. Over the next couple of weeks, I know that the stakes action gets a little bit lighter before the Kentucky Derby. That always seems to happen. There aren't that many graded stakes. So maybe over the next couple of podcasts, we can do a little bit more handicapping of some Kentucky Derby preps. We can talk about races in retrospect as we go back and reassess how things are looking now a few months down the road. If any of our opinions have changed since then. I know eventually we'll be getting some advanced past performances for the Kentucky Derby, and we can talk about pace projectors and things like that. So we'll touch on all of those topics in future podcasts. But for now, the Derby preps are all done, and we can take stock of what's in the field. So, Craig, great talking about these races with you, and we'll do more of it in the next couple of weeks. As always, you can listen to the TimeformUS Pacecast on drf.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, SoundCloud, any of those places where you get your podcasts. Just search for Daily Racing Form and the TimeformUS Pacecast. So thanks for listening, guys, and we'll see you next week.